temos connosco, como alguns já ouviram noutra sala, o Sr. Daniel D'Agostino, e ele agora vai falar, naquela sala falou do produto novo, e falou não só do integrado, mas tivemos a sorte de ouvir falar, portanto, da filosofia dele mesmo, daquilo, digamos, do que ele pensa, as suas opiniões pessoais da eletrónica e como ele constrói os seus produtos. Agora vai-nos falar, portanto, das peças separadas dele. Dan, if you please.
Okay. Hi, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
This is my first time in Portugal. Beautiful country. I should have come here sooner.
We hope so. We hope
Your
so.
life is going to be completely different after today.
Yes.
Or after yesterday.
I'll tell you a little bit about how the Momentum amplifier and preamp were developed. When I started the design of the Momentum amplifier 3 years ago, I wanted to do something very different from what I did in the past. I mean, I'm known for making great big, heavy, hot Class A amplifiers that all the men loved and all the women hated. Says, I'm not putting that in my house, it's too big, it's too ugly. So I said, well, I learned something over the years. I want to make something beautiful. I had a friend, Japanese friend, that kind of mentored me and told me many years ago, make something beautiful that sounds good and people will like it better. And he's right. But I never got the chance to do it until I had a clean slate. You know, when you're doing something for 30 years, you kind of have a history and a lineage that you have to keep on following. So you can't just change everything you're doing. But when you can start after 30 some years of experience with a totally clean slate, now you have a chance to make a real difference in what you want to do. So I looked and I said, first I want to make something small. I started out wanting to make something really small, but I realized when I do that I have virtually no power. And I wanted to have power because I think it's necessary to play music, that you have some real solid power foundation to play music. Speakers are very efficient, and yes, you can drive them with a 10-watt amplifier, but the results are not as pleasing overall as it is to drive them with a really big, good sounding amplifier. So I wanted something that made really decent power, but then I kind of forced myself to play around with 3D rendering software to look at shapes and sizes, and I finally came up with this look, which kind of I had in my head, but I finally massaged it to look like this. And I got the box as big as I could, but made the dimensions very pleasing. And you know, I'm a big car fan and a big watch fan, and I like high-tech things, and I like old cars and new cars. And I kind of wanted something that replicated a really fine watch in its finish, but also had kind of a flair to it that would attract you when you looked at it. And that's kind of how I massaged this design. If you look at the finish on these are finished in a synthetic enamel, and they're cut with a diamond cutter, so that you see the lines and you can feel them and actually hear them if you run your fingers on them, even though they're finished with this very hard acrylic enamel. I mean, it's not acrylic, it's a synthetic enamel. The heat sinks are copper, and the reason why they're copper is because I couldn't cool a 300-watt amplifier with aluminum and keep it that size. In order to use aluminum, it would be at least that much wider. I mean, it would be this wide, and it wouldn't look as pretty. So I'd have to have fins. But the copper allows me, some of the principles of copper, it absorbs heat 91% faster than aluminum, which is very good. But the fact that on the Momentum, the copper is really thick and heavy, so there's a long term before it actually gets warm. So that the thermal reluctance in there and the fact that it has high rates of absorption for heat makes it very stable temperature-wise. So output devices, like every semiconductor, likes to operate at one temperature all the time. So copper reaches this temperature and holds the output device there, and it's very equilibrium. It never gets too hot and it never gets cold. So it's very good for output devices. But when I designed the amplifier, the hard part was to make it have a huge amount of power in a really small box. So the big thing was designing this. First of all, the sound was the most important. But going past that, let's get to the power supply part. Because this amplifier puts out excessive of 300 watts into 8, about 700 watts into 4, and close to 1400 watts into 2. So it's got some real power. That's a lot of power in a very small box. So doing that required a very special power supply, which means I had to get a very special transformer made. I spent a lot of time and money all around the country looking for a transformer vendor. This is when I lived in Connecticut. And then I remembered a gentleman I did business with 20-some years ago that had a small transformer manufacturing plant right in Connecticut, about a half hour from where I lived. So I looked him up and I called him, and he's probably in his late 70s. And I called on the phone and I said, "Is Ulrich still there?" He says, "Oh yeah, he's there," and I talked to him. And I said, "I got this problem." I said, "I bought transformers everywhere, nothing works, I'm trying to do this." He said, "Bring me the box that you have." So I brought him a mock-up of this box with a circle drawn in it and a height dimension drawn in it. I said, "Ulrich, this is what I have to have, 1500 VA transformer in this box." So he looked at it and he goes, "Wow." He said, "This is a big problem." Huh? So he said, "Leave me the box." So I left him the box, and 2 days later, he called me up. And this is what I remembered from him from the time I started working with him, is he can make you a transformer in 2 days. So 2 days later, he called me up, he says, "I got your transformer." I said, "You got it designed?" He said, "No, I have your transformer." So I went there, I picked up the transformer, I brought it home and tested it, and after $10,000 worth of other transformers in a big pile, I put this one transformer in and it worked perfect first time. So that's how the building block of this started. And then the rest of it is just putting a lot of high-powered parts in there. Capacitors and rectifiers and all that stuff in that little box. But let's get to the sound a little bit. To get to this sound, I had every amplifier that I had ever designed at Krell I had in my house. And when I left Krell, I still had all these amplifiers. I didn't have any speakers because I sold all my speakers because I wanted to get something different. But when I started this company, I didn't have a lot of cash to buy a speaker. So I called up Dave Wilson. I said, "Dave, I'm designing an amplifier and I need a pair of speakers." So I've known Dave for 30-some years. He said, "Sure." So he sent me a pair of Sashas, Wilson Sashas, and I brought them and I said, "Wow, these are great to play with." And we played with them. I have a couple friends, 5 of them, that would come over and we'd compare amplifiers, and we went through all the Krell amplifiers. We lined up with 2 of them that we all really liked. And then they brought their amplifiers over from different companies, and we listened to them, and we quantified like 4 amplifiers that we thought if you were to get one amplifier that did all these things, you'd have a perfect amplifier. So when I did the first circuits for the Momentum, we all got together, brought it in there. I got them to come on Saturday night because I like to cook and drink wine. So they would come on Saturday afternoon and we'd cook, we'd drink wine, we'd listen to music and compare things. And I had the first circuits of the Momentum working. So we would listen to them and we'd make some comments. We'd listen to the other 4 amplifiers and comments. And then I'd take these 2 big carts and I'd wheel them back, because this is in my house. So I had a big office in the back of my house, about this big, and I had all my test equipment and a bunch of junk in there for testing, building amplifiers. So I'd wheel the amplifiers in, make some changes on the circuitry, change where the gain was, and change some of the stuff. An hour later, I'd come out and we'd listen again, and they'd say, "Oh yeah, that was in the right direction. This is better or worse." And then the next weekend, we'd do the same thing, and during the week, I'd be working and making some changes and doing this, and until I got a sound that we all agreed was better than anything that we had, and better than any of the 4 pieces, and in fact, better than any of them, even if they were together. And when we finally all agreed on that, I went and I had a used equipment company come in my house and bought all of my old Krell equipment. All of it. I mean, believe me, if we put it all, it would almost fill this room. And he wrote me one giant check. and that's how I finance his company. And then I called Dave Wilson up and I said, Dave, we got a working unit that sounds great on the Sashas, but before I go to market, I need something a little more revealing. He says, good. He said, let me send you a pair of Alexandrias. So I sent him the Sashas back, and he sent me a pair of Alexandria 2s, which was the best speaker he made at the time. And then I got to make a few more adjustments because that's like a giant window into sound. So I played with that, made some more adjustments, and that's the sound of the Momentum, and I haven't adjusted it since.